Howdy, it's Kyle talking about megalopolis. A megalopolis is when multiple metro areas run into each other, and it can be difficult to tell when one metro ends and the next one begins. When just one metro merges with another one, that will be a combined metro, such as DC Baltimore or Miami Fort Lauderdale. But when multiple combined metro areas merge into one giant blob of humanity, that's a megalopolis. And there's only one true megalopolis in the US, and I will discuss that and its components, but I also wanted to discuss several other areas in the country that might not be a true megalopolis yet, but they are emerging into one. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at the largest areas of urban conglomeration in the US, the megalopolis. I'm going to start off by talking about the one true megalopolis in the US, the one in the Northeast. So as you can see here, it's a big chunk of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. I'm going to zoom in more at the state level here, and you can see it's in the entirety of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, and most of Maryland as well. And as you can see on this map, there are some areas that would be considered rural, and in fact I mentioned some of these areas in recent videos talking about rural areas, but I think what you get here in a megalopolis is a rural area that is surrounded by suburbs or exurbs. So even in the parts of these states where it isn't a big urban area or a large population, you're very close to another large urban center. So for example, in western Massachusetts here, you're in the Berkshires. It's pretty rural, but once you get here, it's the large Albany, Schenectady area. Of course, you have the city down here. Southern New Hampshire is where most of the people in the state live. This is mostly urban, except for the southwestern corner here, but this is the rural areas are very small in this part of the country. Southern Maine, this York County is the southernmost one here. It's got some smaller towns along the coast, but this is Portland, and this basically built up urban all the way down through here. Eastern Pennsylvania, I love how the county lines are formed right here by the ridge and valley, but anyway, this is Eastern Pennsylvania, where you have Philadelphia, Harrisburg, York, Lebanon, Lancaster, Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. It's basically all of the major urban centers of Pennsylvania with the exception of Pittsburgh. You see all of New Jersey here. The southern tip and the northwestern corner of New Jersey are kind of rural, but again, you're surrounded by urban. Delaware is mostly built up. There's some parts in the far south that are not very built up, and all of Maryland, but the Panhandle is, pretty built up, even the exurban parts. And usually people end the megalopolis at Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is right around here, and maybe go as far north as the New Hampshire, Massachusetts line. But I think it really does extend farther south. So you really have to include Richmond, Petersburg, and you go over to the Hampton Roads area. This is Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and Newport News. And this really is, there's not a lot of empty space between these areas and the DC metro up here. And in this direction, it's not like the urban area stops at the Massachusetts New Hampshire line. This southeast corner of New Hampshire is very urban. So I think this megalopolis really extends from Portland down to Petersburg, Virginia, even though most will say it goes from Boston to DC. But this is the most populous megalopolis in the US, the northeast one, about 52 million people. Let's take a look at the other ones in the US. The next one that I want to discuss is the southeastern megalopolis, although this one isn't universally agreed upon as being a megalopolis. And as you can see as to what I have shaded here, that not all of this area is completely urban, but there is enough of an urban conglomeration to where I would consider this kind of a megalopolis emerging. You zoom in a little bit, you can see here in North Carolina, there are about 10.5 million people in the state, and about 10 million are located within this area highlighted in red. Only these higher elevation areas of the mountains and some of these swampier areas along the coast are not part of this. South Carolina here this is an emerging big metro area, the Greenville-Spartanburg area, about almost 1.5 million people in this upstate corner of the state. Columbia is here, Charleston here, and it's mostly built up along the coast in South Carolina as well. Coming over into Georgia, this is the Atlanta metro area, all these counties here. Savannah is down here, and Augusta here, Macon here, and there really isn't much space between the Atlanta suburbs and Macon. It really starts to just run into each other. There's not much space here between Augusta and Columbia, but as you can see here, starting with this megalopolis, it isn't entirely filled in. So you'll see plenty of areas where it's grayed in, and these areas are rural areas surrounded by other rural areas. So You will see some parts that are colored in that are rural, but those are rural areas that are surrounded by suburbs or exurbs. So these higher elevations here, these kind of just farmland areas out here in eastern Georgia, not a lot of people there. And then once you get to southern Alabama and southern Georgia, it gets very, very rural. But there's a lot of people living here, and you talk about big population growth in the South right now in terms of the overall U.S. population. We'll zoom back out, and it's not the entire South that's really growing a lot. It's this big chunk here. Once you get to the areas west of here, there really isn't that much growth. Not a lot of growth up here, not a lot of growth here. So it's mainly this big chunk in the South, as well as the next couple of other megalopolis type things I'm going to be looking at in this video. So when you talk about the South, it's this Piedmont area here, and the coast is not growing as much in this area as you might think. It's more focused on the Piedmont and the mountains in this part of the country. So there are approximately 30 million people in this megalopolis. So again, it's not quite a true megalopolis, but with the population growth going on in this region, it's certainly getting there. The next one that I want to look at is the Great Lakes area. And as you can see, it's part of many states that border the Great Lakes, especially Lake Michigan and Lake Erie. And I'll zoom in here, and you can see it's a big chunk of Michigan. The lower peninsula here is mostly filled in. You might think, well, there's some rural areas, but the lakeshore area is pretty much filled in. Grand Rapids is really close. Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, Lansing. There isn't much space here. Saginaw, and that's before you even get to Flint and the Detroit metro area here. So there are some farms and some rural area there, but it's mostly built up, and that goes on into Ohio. The I-80 corridor, Toledo here, Fort Wayne, South Bend, Indiana. So again, other areas, just like in the South, you'll see some gray areas in the middle of this megalopolis, and these are rural areas surrounded by other rural areas. But some of these other spots are kind of being encroached upon by the surrounding exurbs and suburbs. You get into Wisconsin, almost the entire southeastern quadrant of the state is urban or starting to get filled in. It's not growing a whole lot here, but there isn't a lot of space to work with in the first place. Coming down into Illinois, you'll see a little bit of rural areas here that are along the Indiana border, but Chicago metro kind of fades into Rockford, and not a lot of space between there and the college towns, Bloomington Normal and Champaign-Urbana, and then also into Peoria and Springfield. So it's it's not, Illinois isn't just Chicago and a bunch of farms. A lot of folks think it is, but there are a lot of other population centers in the state, including these ones here that are not that disconnected from the Chicago metro area. So Indiana, obviously going to be a little bit more rural here. You can see some more gray, but Indianapolis to Lafayette up to Chicago is pretty much filled in, and there's a lot of rural areas here, but this area is growing a lot. This area is growing, so it's encroaching. Similar to Ohio, this path here is the I-71 corridor. This is entirely filled in. Cleveland, Akron, Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton here. So Youngstown, Warren over here, Canton. So most of Ohio is filled in, as you can see in this area. The southeast part of Ohio is still very rural, getting into the Appalachian area. But this Great Lakes metro is, this mega region here has about 42 million people, so it's more people than the southern region, but this one isn't really growing as much in population as the one in the south, but again, another large area with continuous metro buildup. And going into the southeast corner of the country, we have Florida. So here's the whole state of Florida, but most of the peninsula of Florida I would consider a part of a megalopolis. It is most of the population of the states. There are just over 22 million people in Florida and about 20 million people in this megalopolis. So you'll see it's the entirety of the Atlantic coast and then coming up the Gulf Coast here. And you'll see this area in the middle is like Lake Okeechobee and real swampy areas, very rural, no real growth there, but Tampa Bay, Orlando, Daytona Beach, Jacksonville up here, Gainesville, Ocala. So if you live in Florida, there really isn't much open space except for this real swampy area here until you get to the Panhandle. So there's a lot of rural areas between Gainesville, Ocala, and then over to Tallahassee. So this is pretty rural, but this peninsular part of Florida is being built up a lot, still growing a lot in population. Again, right now 22 million, it might have 25 million or so by the end of the decade. So a lot of people living here, A lot of people moving here, and it's becoming a larger and larger megalopolis. The next mega region wholly contained within a state is this one here in Texas, and you'll hear people talk a lot about the Texas Triangle, which is the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex up here, the San Antonio-Austin area down here, and the Houston-Galveston Bay area here. So it isn't quite a perfect triangle, but it is a good way to kind of look at it. I've also heard the term Texaplex being used. I like that better. That's a pretty cool term for this area. But as you can see, there is a lot of open area between Dallas and Houston. So this is the I-45 corridor. Houston is growing this way, Dallas is growing this way, but there is still a decent amount of rural area between the two. Not so much on the I-35 corridor between Fort Worth and Austin. It's mostly built up there. Killeen, Temple, Waco. There's not a lot of space here. So even though Houston is the bigger city, there's more of a connection in terms of continuous buildup between Dallas, Fort Worth Metroplex and the Austin, San Antonio area. Now, Austin and San Antonio are not as close to each other as Dallas and Fort Worth, so they're not growing into each other like a lot of people are saying. There is some open space between the two, and even if they fully grow into each other, it's still not quite the same because they're about as far as Chicago and Milwaukee and not DC and Baltimore or Dallas and Fort Worth. So, but also there isn't much space between San Antonio and Austin either. So 30 million people in Texas, approximately 24 million people live in this urban conglomeration here, about 8 million or so here, about 7 million or so here, about 5 million or so here, and then just other areas filling in. Coming down to here, Corpus Christi, this is still starting to get filled in a little bit. And surprisingly enough, South Texas, the beaches are not developed a lot. A lot of it's just one giant ranch. Who knows what will happen when that giant ranch, the guy who owns it, dies, or who knows what will happen. It might become one giant continuous hotel buildup down the coast like at Florida. And this might be all red as well. But for right now, this area is safe from development with the big ranch. But this whole Texaplex, Texas Triangle area is most of the population of the state. So you think about how big Texas is, 30 million, but this whole, everything else is maybe 5 million people with 1.5 million down here and 1 million over here. So most of this is pretty rural, but this part here is getting pretty crowded. And the last one that I want to look at within the U.S. is this California megalopolis. And as you can see, it's California, but a little tiny part of Nevada here. This is the Lake Tahoe, Reno area. But I'll zoom in on this. And one problem with California and counties is this thing here is San Bernardino. It's just a giant county colored in red, but the people only basically live where this cursor is right now. Most of the rest of this county is just open desert, but the people live here. Riverside County here is the people live here. So this area is not built up, and this area here is high Sierra Nevada. But the point is, the coastal area is basically built up the entire way. This is the Big Sur area where there is some national park and protected areas here, but there isn't much space. And even with all the NIMBYs trying as hard as they can to make sure nobody else can have a house along the coast, it is still pretty much built up along the way here. And this whole area is becoming one big region. This greater Bay Area, San Joaquin Delta area with Stockton and Modesto up to Sacramento. Much cheaper to live here. So a lot of folks are working in the Bay Area, taking the trains over here. This is the San Joaquin Valley where I'm from. There's a lot of rural areas, a lot of farms, but you don't go too far before you're into the next town. And then down here into Los Angeles, Orange County, and San Diego. So approximately just under 40 million people in California, and almost all of them live in this part of the state, about 38 million. So there are only maybe a million or so people up here, and it's a handful of people in the rest of the state. So most of California is in this kind of megalopolis. And again, this part here where it's red is not really built up at all. So it's desert, but 38 million people in all that right there. A lot of folks, small area. I also want to make special mention of Canada here. As you can see, this is a map of the country, and this area in red is where half of the people in the country live. This is called the Main Street area, or the Windsor, Quebec City corridor. So here is Windsor right across the river from Detroit. Quebec City over here. Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, Niagara Falls, Hamilton. So of the 40 million people that live in Canada, 20 million live right here in Main Street. So you think about how enormous of a country Canada is, and for half of it to live just right here is pretty crazy. So almost nobody lives here, and most of the rest of the population lives right over here. So most of Canada is just very small towns, if not completely empty or wilderness. You put it all together, and here's a map showing all of the megalopolises in the US, and the combined population is about 208 million people. So approximately 2/3 of all Americans live in just these areas highlighted in red. So here's the one, the northeast one, and here's the southeast one. But Mother Nature hooking us up right here. This is the Great Dismal Swamp, swampy areas. So there probably won't be development here. So you can at least kind of breathe a sigh of relief that these two won't be completely connected. Mother Nature coming through in the clutch again down here with the Okefenokee Swamp. People don't like swamps. It's a good deterrent to development. So there likely won't be a connection between these two metros here. Higher elevations here is going to deter some development. So you're not going to get a lot of combining of the metros here. And that's what's keeping these areas from being fully developed. Protected areas, high mountains, elevations and stuff. So Texas, this area is growing, but there's still, Texas is just so big, and there's still so few people that live right here. I don't see this area being fully, covered in red anytime soon. Coming up into the Great Lakes here, again, some of these rural areas are not really being filled in, but this part here, lower Michigan, is really starting to grow a lot. And this great, Lake Michigan area is just, basically one giant continuous buildup. And even with people leaving California, the population, it was still 40 million. So even if 500,000 leave, there's still 39.5 million. So, yeah, a lot of folks right here, they're all along the coast, basically, or the areas that are within just a couple-hour drive of the coast. And here's old stupid San Bernardino making it look like it's worse than it is. But, 38 million people right here. So, again, 208 million people, 2/3 of the U.S. population living in these areas. So if you don't live in these areas, you're probably thinking, wow, I'm glad it's not like that. But if you live on the fringe of some of these, guess what? It's coming for you. The megalopolis. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography. You're not going to get explosions and special effects here, but if you want more of a nerdy type perspective, this is the channel for you. But thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Dylan from Los Gatos. If you're interested in supporting the channel or to purchase a pin for the viewer pin map, check out my Patreon page, link in the description. But as always, thank you very much,